But first things first, let's maybe start about the talk today. I'll briefly introduce our guests. Next to me is Demeester, who started her career in journalism and the Morgen and the Tijd. Then she was basically asked by Jan Hoet to write his speeches, which he did, but he never used them apparently. Is that true? Okay. Then you also worked here a while before you became the director of W139 in Amsterdam, a venue that now I think unfortunately had to close down because of the subsidy cuts. No? Oh, good news, good news.
They always survive.
Great. So then you were director of the Appel, Frans Hals Museum, and now Kunsthaus Zürich, which you're working today. Next to you is Lorenzo Benedetti, a Paris-based curator, studied at La Sapienza in Rome. Also founded in 2004 the Sound Art Museum in Rome. Then you worked with Jan Hoet and Martha Herford, the museum he initiated in 2005, followed by being a director in Vleeshal Middelburg, and you were also curator of the much acclaimed Dutch pavilion at the Venice Biennale with Mark Manders. And you were also director of the Appel, following the footsteps of Demeester. And currently you are co-director of Fondazione Antonio Ratti in Como. And then last but not least, Philippe Van Cauteren, who's been director since 2004 of S.M.A.K. You also created several exhibitions abroad, Germany and Brazil, Iraqi Pavilion and the Venice Biennale, and the first edition of the Kathmandu Triennale. But let's maybe start with you, Anne. Welcome, or rather welcome back. As I mentioned before, you have been working here in S.M.A.K. In interviews, you keep on mentioning that Jan was the person who initiated you in the world of curating. How did that go?
I think in hindsight, it's very difficult to understand it, because in the current time, I don't think that would be possible anymore. I was a journalist like you were previously, and on the side of observing art, critiquing art, analyzing it, which means you're part of the art world, but you're not. You're on the island of your own. And Jan Hoet asked me, he called me up one day at the editor's office of the Tijd, and said like, Ms. Demeester, I'm looking for an assistant. I was like, yes. I said, what, so you don't want to work for me? An unusual type of procedure that now we would sort of esteem very, very unprofessional, but was very much in line with how Jan functioned. And I was excited, but also estranged by this idea, because I never thought of entering the other side of the art world, or the side that we are all now in, of curating, of producing, of being a sort of midwife to artistic practice. But as things developed, I thought like, okay, this is a chance not to miss. Like, how could you not want to work with such a personality and learn from him, from his encyclopedic knowledge? So I just said yes, and I started out as his speechwriter, or anyway, general. Jan hated writing text. He was an excellent, eloquent person to speak out freely in space, improviser, but written words on the written page were not his thing, and they were very much mine. So I wrote his catalogue text, almost like a, you say that, buikspreekpop, like a, yes, ventriloquist. And then started also writing out speech notes, but that he never used, so I gave up on that. But in his sort of, and we were discussing this over lunch, John was always actually providing possibilities that were open and vague. And one day he said, well, why don't you curate something? But I had never conceptualized any exhibition, definitely not thought of executing one, but it was an opportunity offered. And then I discovered that being on the other side was a much more fascinating thing. If you could be part of a process of creation and existence, rather than only judging or analyzing the result. That's a very long-winded answer, and maybe that's not what you wanted to hear.
But I was wondering, so the first exhibition you created with Jan, if I'm not mistaken, was Storm Centers in 2000 in Watu. In an interview in the newspaper The Standard, you described it as the most beautiful, but also the most intense summer of my life. Yeah. These are quite strong words. What happened?
Well, I think Jan was clever in proposing that I work with him on that, because I come from literature and have a penchant for the written word. So Watu seemed like a logical place. But working with Jan, and that's probably something that Philippe and Lorenzo could would share, I presume they both look very sternly at me, so I'm not sure if that's, is that he would say like, okay, we're going to do this show. He was not a very conceptual person, so there was an idea, and I've invited so many artists, and now you invite 30 more, and then you just do it. But I had never done a show. I didn't know what it entailed. I mean, and on the top of that, we were in a village in the west of Flanders, where I come from, where there's nothing. So it felt you had to improvise everything from scratch, luckily guided by also Agnes and Gwij Mandeling. But it was so, it was not a job, it was a life. It was 24 hours, but it was also incredibly exciting on two levels. Orla Barry, who participated in that show, then said that it was like summer camp. You were isolated outside of the museum in an environment where art normally had no place, and everything had to be invented from scratch. So that was, and it was my first time. So that made it such a remarkable time.
But of course, I imagine there must have also been some conflict, because there are interviews that you're mentioning Jan Hoet as your mentor, but you also say your mentor ex negativo. Often you said you did things the way he taught you or the other way around. We know Jan Hoet, he seemed to like to work according to the principle of antagonism. I think in order to create this collection, this museum, there was a lot of opposition which he had to fight against, but that probably also gave him energy. I'm also looking at you, Philippe. You once called him, in an interview, pardon my French, een vriendelijke klootzak, a friendly asshole. Again, sorry my expression. Not an easy person to work with, as we all know. How did that go for you? Because you basically, in 2003, Jan retired. Brief stint with Peter Doroshenko, then you took it over from him. Jan, he created S.M.A.K, but he was very strongly identified with the museum, maybe a bit too strong, actually. So how did you go ahead running this museum, following your own way, but still respecting the DNA of this institution?
Only this question would already be... I could take an hour for answering it, but which I won't do. No. First, maybe I can comment why I call Jan, and I say this with praise and respect, why I call him a sympathetic bastard. I think I see it as a compliment, because he was uniting these two characteristics in one. As an artist or as an employee or as a collector, or in the morning you could be embraced and you could be praised and taken to heaven, but 5 hours later or in the evening at the dinner you arrive in hell. And for many people it was really difficult to understand, like while working on the exhibition Over the Edges in 2000, many artists in the morning, like young artists like Marco Boggiacella or other ones who were very young, were thinking, okay, I'm the one, he says I'm better than boys and so on and so on. So they thought, okay, it's the moment. But then suddenly it was not the moment at all anymore. And for an external person, it was really difficult to understand. And to understand what in between this kind of two words, the sympathy and the bastardness, how attractive it can also be at the same time, and also how annoying it can be at the same time. But I think that it would not be possible anymore today, I think, but that's another question. But I think that most of us working with Jan, and also see Hans and Dirk and some other people, had in one way or another the capacity to deal with this kind of remarkable construction of human qualities. And then, of course, I was living abroad, and then suddenly I was asked to return to Ghent. After the crisis with Peter Doroshenko, and of course it's why I remember that I was saying to Luc Tuymans that I felt myself like a UN peacekeeper, because this was a kind of a war zone. This was a very complex moment of time in the museum. And the complexity was also, of course, as Jan was still in Herford, but was still being retired at a certain moment of time, every day present in the bar of the museum and having opinions on everything, even on things that one would prefer he wouldn't have opinions. So it was very complicated, and it was complicated in the sense, I think it's true for Anne and Lorenzo, we went far. Like most of the people who intensely worked together with Jan, sacrificed a lot of things and did it with the kind of infinite energy almost. But at a certain moment of time, this turned out to be very difficult because you don't know anymore. Okay, suddenly you take care of this institution as a whole, so you're in another position. But at the same time, the same mechanisms that he was using beforehand and that you were like praising were suddenly like something which has a kind of very destructive nature. So you had to try, or I tried, and I don't know if I succeeded, but you try to form a program for the museum with utter respect towards Jan, but also with a certain form of critical distance. And that was also one of the first questions when I have been called back in those days in Hamburg, because it was first the idea to be 6 months around. If this was an idea which was by whom this idea was formulated, and that came from the board of the museum. I don't know if Jan would have proposed it, if I would have accepted it, which also explains the complexity also of situations.
And talking about Marta Herford, maybe you, Lorenzo, you started working with Jan between 2005, 2008. How did that go about?
That was I was at the time I was in Rome, so for Jan I was a kind of interesting figure because I'm probably the
You
only
didn't
one
have to live there. I lived there.
Yeah, but I'm not so I'm not Belgian, but I'm half Dutch and half Italian, which you bring together as a kind of Belgium. So for him was a kind of interesting because he had always a very he was always very fascinated by Italy. He was a lot in Italy. I knew him from Italy. And in Italy, he was a kind of very, very famous figure, of course. And when he did the documenta, he had, of course, an Italian curator and a Greek one and a Belgian one. So for him, Italy was interesting. So he brought in Germany. He saw the documenta counter for him, where he brought also the Italian. So in Herford, I was coming from Rome, so I was in the newspaper, was ein Romer in Herford, so it was a kind of clash between Rome and Herford. Everybody was saying, it was a big contrast because Herford was, as you know, it's a very small place with a very big museum and with a very famous museum director. And everything was actually a contrast there. Everything was the opposite of what you can imagine. So a sleepy, small German city had suddenly this incredible place where everything was happening and everything could happen. I think Herford was like a very strange experiment. And the combination of the building of Gary and Jan Hoet was really something totally exceptional. It's hard to think this kind of combination, this kind of crazy cocktail of things together. So for me, from Rome was quite strong to see also a Belgium in Germany. It was also fantastic, and fantastic combination because his way to do, and was mentioning German loved him because he was always taking a decision, always very clear in what was the direction of the museum, and in the same time he was making a lot of jokes. And in Germany, it's not a place of jokes. So everything was based about a lot of interesting contrasts. And at the end, what is interesting by him is that everything linked to Jan is based about this, but it's a bit the topic of today. This kind of private and public, to how a person can be the whole program of a museum, of a vision on the arts, how much his biography is linked to everything on that. And that basically was always this thing. There was always and every moment there was this kind of aspect of him, his vision, but it was also this kind of way to deal with the idea of a museum. So this big Gary museum, which is another, there was also two egos together, so Jan Hoet and Gary. There was already a kind of energy in this sense because there was at the beginning the museum was, of course, there was a big Gary museum, and so he had to do a program where there was a kind of very strong against this strong identity of of Gary, and then of course there was this chain of elements that are based about what you were saying about contrast. No, I think everything is about contrast, and that was, I think, the whole program in Hereford was based about these ideas where you put things together and they basically are starting to create a dynamic together that are very energetic, all this contrast, because it was putting together combination, like also working with other creators, and that was always a kind of energetic way. The museum was also founded, by the way, by an energy company, was Eon. So there was I think there was this kind of idea of what is a museum was not to produce this pure energy was this.
Because I'm also thinking specifically about an exhibition that you created with Jan in 2008, Ad Absurdum, which sounds also very Jan Hoet-like, the absurd, the irrational. I think it was also an exhibition that was, we will talk about it later with Anos, of course, the transhistorical. It was more modern art as well involved. Do you have any memories about that specific exhibition?
Yeah, the exhibition Ad Absurdum was one of this kind of strong exhibition about this contrast, because it was a big exhibition, very big, and then we had to decide for the catalog, to make the catalog, and Tonic was working at the time, and they were making this catalog was quite interesting because it was really maybe the biggest exhibition at the time, and the catalog was very small. It was like a postcard format, but very thick. And so to bring
Contrast again.
The contrast. So to concentrate all this Ad Absurdum to actually something that is a very small book with, I don't know, 600 pages, with everything was closed. And it was an exhibition where he could put one of his topics that was like related then to open mind, to a lot of exhibition that to do with this idea of absurdity, of loss of control. I mean, there was a whole line of exhibition, and Absurdum was for sure one of the exhibition. The other thing about the relation about Jan and the artist is interesting, because of course he had a very strong connection with artists, but he had a very strong connection also with art history, in a way that everything was basically living. He was always talking about Giacometti, about Ensor, like they were there, and there was this idea to make everything contemporary, everything at a new life, and there was no this kind of museal view on the old art. It was always a kind of everything was bring to the contemporary sector, and that I think that is a very important thing that is very hard to see. And he was really able to do it in a certain way to activate the past, to create something that was not not just that is good and now we do something next to it because it's the same color. He was just bringing like Giacometti, like he was a young artist now, and putting and that change of paradigm about hierarchies in time was one of his things, which was very important, with other ones which were like hierarchies and artists, and he was breaking a lot of hierarchies, in a certain way.
And regarding this, I don't know if we can call it transhistorical, that's maybe going a bridge too far, but on Jan indeed, he often did include older artists, like historical artists, within his contemporary art exhibitions. Maybe you could also say because he was more of a generalist, I guess. How do you relate to that?
No, I think it was because he was an artist by heart. He was an artist by heart and an artist by training, and not an art historian. And I think what Lorenzo said, I think Lorenzo formulated it very beautifully. So I think, at least also in Lorenzo's practice, and maybe a bit less with Philippe, because you're very much into contemporary art, and in my practice, this is a sort of given that the artwork is always in the present. Not like that the past, was it Faulkner that said the past is not history, it's not even the past. No, it's not even over. And I think that's a kind of very indirect lesson. I think what people remember him by Lorenzo is his explosiveness. He was a volcano, and he was a media man, and he put all together these shows that broke the boundaries of the museum. But for me, it is a transhistorical idea that came from his artist practice, that he felt free to connect things from art history.
Is that something that you felt inspired you in your present practice? Or?
Absolutely, totally, because I come from literature, and the biggest fights I always had with him. I mean, we talked about this, not antagonism, or maybe Chantal Mouffe would call it agonism, but he lived from that, like building up, breaking down. There was no in between. So I think that sort of inspired me very much, not to repeat it, but as a source. But the other thing was indeed, he would mix outsider art with historical art. I remember a small little show I did with him in Apex Art, an insignificant space in New York, where we started from a painting from the S.M.A.K by Theo van Rijsselbergen, and then put that together with Manfred Pernice and Jessica Diamond and David Hammonds. And it was a perfectly natural thing that was not meant to be transgressive or provocative. And I think that was his artistic way of dealing with art history, not as something that's strict categories with labels, but just it's art. And art means that it can resonate with each other, whether it's from the 15th century or from the 21st century.
The reason also why you're all, of course, united is that Jan, you all learned something from Jan. There was an entire generation of curators, actually, that he trained, if I can use that term, or trained ex negativo, as you would say. Of course, Bart de Bare, who also worked here in S.M.A.K, then became director of M.U.K, was also co-curator of Documenta. Eva Wittox, Rolf Kagebuur, you name it. That's one of his merits, you could say, but maybe should be see one of his biggest merits, the fact that he taught people to look at art, because he has a background as a teacher. He seemed to be very vocal, very good in talking, discussing art, bringing art to the house room. How do you see that as one of his merits, or anybody?
But maybe something in between also, you know, which is something I regret, and I deeply regret, is that, and also you feel this in the documentary which has been made. Thank you for the gift. I like the title and not the rest. David Hammond's words on Jan's funeral, is that more and more we forget, or we do not want to look at the merits and the achievements that Jan has been realizing. And it's a bit bon ton to be very critical towards Jan Hoet. And as I speak for myself, one of the things which I think is the key lesson that I learned from him is to have an incredible respect, and also as an institution commitment towards artists, and not to compromise in this, and to you know, to keep on going for the artists. And that's a position which today is almost out of fashion, is almost something which is awkward or quaint for some people. But it's something that I think that he was really, you know, representing.
But this again, it's maybe the doubleness, right? There was no distance also between him and the museum. It all came together, him and the museum, him and the artist, that some people reproached him this kind of distance. So it's a double sword, I would say, no? Or
I don't think he had any filter. I mean, he was an intellectual man as well as an intuitive one, but he was always on fire. And as Philippe said, like, he had this extreme proximity to artists. But in relation to your question, I think he was an excellent mediator. He would never have called it mediation, or what we now call in German Vermittlung, but he knew how to translate complexity into something simple that a lot of people could identify with, even if they would maybe be afraid of contemporary art or think it's strange. But he had this capacity, and even he would often ramble, and it would make totally no sense, but it still would kind of bring the message across. And I think that is, or at least for me, that was also really a source of inspiration, and something that I think is really part actually of the role of the museum director. But he was one of maybe the rare ones who did it, who did not enclose himself in a castle of analytical art speak, but spoke with simplicity and desire about art, and therefore ignited a lot of people.
Here again, I think this double-sidedness. Also, a lot of people reproached him exactly as so-called lack of theory, and I'm especially looking at you two, Anne and Lorenzo, because you've both been directors of the Apple, and for its curatorial programs, for its discursive events. So how do you look to this emotional, rational divine that was, again, Jan was a very poetic person talking about art, but some people, what about the theory lacking? How do you relate about that? Or
well, I think that the theory it's something that for several things is also creating a kind of anesthetic, which he was totally intolerant for. This kind of in the art
He
world
hated the witte raaf. We all know that.
that is no, but probably that also the fact that everything should be too much conceptualized, and he of course was very direct on the sense of very simple concepts, and I think today is, if you think about a museum, you should think about how this building is here, and what was the reason to create from one city, one place that was an important center. And I was coming with the train today in Ghent, and you see all the houses, and not so often last year here, but if you look at all these houses, all these windows, and I have to think, okay, that is the museum, that's Champ-de-My, and you see actually how much he was putting this thing of the museum inside the houses of the city. And so actually this parallel, which is only possible in Ghent, because Jan Hoet is an incredible strong conceptual theoretic thing that should be the base of every single museum. Of course, he took it from he was taking everything from other people. He was very good in that. He was not thinking himself. He was just choosing the good thing and bringing it together. Of course, the idea of Champ-de-My was coming from something else in Bari. The title was coming from somebody else. He put it together and he did it. But at the end, this generated a series of things which are the basis of concepts like to whom belongs the museums. And with Jan Hoet it's very easy. The museum belongs to the people around the museum, to the city, and then
But maybe
you
Lorenzo,
go on.
just
And
so that we also disagree a little bit. It was problematic, I think, at the time that Jan was, because he was such a dominant figure, and I was mentioning his hatred of the witte raaf. He didn't tolerate discursiveness or theory, and because he was such a larger-than-life figure, that was also what was the trend in the Belgian artwork world. And I remember the fights I had with him coming from literature. He would always say you see everything as narrative. Stop thinking about ideas and concepts. It's just sometimes just form, which was great. But because he was a larger-than-life figure, that also stunted the discussions a bit, because very few people dared to engage in that confrontation with him to disagree. So I do think at a certain point that was something negative, because I have learned, and I loved his informed intuition, but you had to stand up against him as well if you had other ideas. And I think at a certain point that was problematic. He dominated the discourse, and there was no space for anything else. But now that he's no longer there, I no longer see it as negative, because it's a position, and there were other positions as well. I'm just trying to provoke some discussion here. So you have to disagree with me.
Comfortable in these chairs.
No, the thing about theory, as you mentioned, he was not a writer. He could never write. He was not against. It was not his thing. So he could not write. He had another position. But another position, I think, in the same time, he was a very political person. He could say, I have this position. You can have another position. There was a discussion. He was always very strong in discussions. And of course, it was not so easy to have another opinion and to go in discussion. But this was one of his idea to create this kind of Spannung, this kind of contrast, this kind of, this tension that you have. And sometimes you need, in several places. And then, of course, you have to see it, if you put it now, we're in 2024, so 10 years later, the whole landscape changed. So now, the tension there, it's also more complicated. It should be very inside, grids. But I think that theory was not his thing. But at the same time, he was quoting a lot of things about theory, and he brought another point of view, which was very different, probably from the academic. It was this Warburg, Freud people, not from the academy. That for sure, and the academy hated him. So that was this kind of figure. I think it's in this sense, you're right that he was in this sense he could not really be there.
And I think something else can be connected to this. The moment of the opening of the museum, which is also the moment of Over the Edges, I think is a kind of a turning point. Because that's the moment also that the broad media have been discovering Jan Hoet, and that he was appearing in talk shows, and that he was like promoting aluminium and all kind of things, and that he suddenly saw that he could really infiltrate quite deeply into this kind of, even having a kind of double in one or another television program, which also meant that from that moment of time a certain form of preciseness got a little bit lost. I remember this very well. You had Over the Edges, the opening of the museum, and 2001 was the S.M.A.K exhibition, which was supposed to be a show with 40 artists and turned out to be 75 artists, of which one wondered, okay, is this needed? Why? And you felt that Jan was at that moment of time not so much occupied with S.M.A.K, but how he would be perceived in talking about S.M.A.K and in provoking a number of people and the local authorities and political parties and so on and so on. And I think this has to do with this kind of turning moment from the moment that the museum became a kind of real material reality, which also means that the whole operation of the museum started to change.
Because indeed, that's again the flip side of his enthusiasm, indeed the spectacle society. But sorry, I think I interrupt you, Lorenzo. Maybe you wanted to add up something to that. Again, this contrast, this flip side actually. It's very interesting that you position it at the opening of the museum. As we all remember, the opening of the museum, there was a famous box match. Earlier in Chambre d'Amis, you could say there were also some seats started already. I remember, okay, that's not him, but that's De Langste Dag, 6 hours live television, including helicopter shots. Some people say that already the beginning of this kind of spectacle of society in this landscape. Yeah. How do you see that? Like you would still position it more at the opening of the museum, actually?
Absolutely. I think because the Langste Dag with Chambre d'Amis, this was almost a kind of artistic project. Imagine today a 24 hours or 12 hours program on primetime television, it would be unthinkable. And having the liaisons and all the intellectual debates and so on and so on. So this is like a kind of indication of what you're mentioning, Sam. But it's mostly 1999, and that's also pity. Like in this documentary being made, we mostly talk about these things, but let's not forget the exceptional relationship that Jan Hoet had with David Hammons, way before that. Pinot and so many other people have been discovering David Hammons. These are also things which should be more explored, and I think that the exhibition that is currently taking place with the dialogue between the two collections, and also the fact that 10 years after his passing, that we try to make an exhibition and an indirect homage, which doesn't have to do with all this kind of characteristics of the persona Jan Hoet, but with the things that he left, namely the fantastic work of Hans Haake and Fabro and Darboven and so on and so on, and namely, 3 key exhibitions that we are like also referring to: Documenta, Chambre d'Amis, and Art in Europe after '68. And this is something I think which is we tend mostly, even in the art world, we tend to talk about the eccentric person he was, but we tend to forget the achievements that he has been realizing and the commitment he had towards artists, taking David Hammons as one of many examples, of course.
But maybe that's also very much in Belgium, because I think internationally people speak about Jan Hoet not as this choleric, intuitive force of nature that dominated the media, but much more indeed as the creator of Chambre d'Amis, the creator of Documenta 9, the part of a generation that is now slowly dying, or maybe now that Casper Koenig has died, they have all but evaporated. So maybe it's also inevitable in Belgium that it's also connected to his person. Well, I feel the museum I work at now, Kunsthaus, we have an equally kind of mythological figure, Harald Seemann, who was less of an explosive personality. But there you also feel, in Switzerland people also talk about Seemann as a person and maybe how much of a sexist he actually was now. But outside of Switzerland, we talk about Museum der Obsessionen, we talk about his shows Austria am Rosennet. So maybe it's also about where you are from. You're much more also seen as this personality. Well, I think if we take a little bit more distance, people do now also revere Jan Hoet, but maybe mostly for his shows. And I think it's interesting what you do now is also maybe two things to, I don't know, sorry Sam, I'm also curious in the opinion of my colleagues. One thing is that I think internationally we discuss his shows and how paradigmatic shifts they were. We talk less about what did he leave in the collection. You know, like from the Kabakov, I also always thought that the Jason Rhodes was part of, so really incredible artworks for a museum without budget, like how he created that from scratch. And the other part is maybe the amazing contrast that he really was not a museum man. I mean, everything that a museum stands for, to collect, to preserve, to research, he was all about this now, that he really succeeded in creating a museum of contemporary art that was all about making contemporaneity happen. That he really had this, remember the techno parties we had here, in, when was that? I'm getting old. That was crazy. And completely irresponsible, but he really knew how to make an institution dynamic. It also had downsides. I mean, stupid anecdotes. I remember, I don't know if it was with Philippe, we had to courier a work, and then it turned out that the work was not in the crate because Jan had taken it out. So it was also, that had downsides, but how, I think one of the questions we have as museum directors, how do you make a museum a lively institution? He knew how to do that. And he has built up a collection, seemingly randomly, not with a collection plan, of remarkable works.
Talking about his collection, he often talked about his intuition. He has a gut feeling. He felt something, and then afterwards he said he felt it because he had already interiorized. And maybe especially Philippe, as you're most familiar with the collection, how would you judge his intuitive decisions and his collection policy? If there was a policy at all, but his collection.
No, it's nice when you say interiorized, which also it sounds almost like interiorized. So in that sense, it's not. I mean, it's less random that people try to judge the collection to be random, and I think he had like a kind of internal structure in it with some key figures and some key moments, and you have Beuys and Panamarenko and Brotaars, and from there on the Arte Povera and Bruce Nauman, and also things which have been reflected in the Documenta. And this was kind of the matrix or the structure from which everything could find a place, I think. But indeed, it's not something which he was like, justifying, or it was not something that he was like writing about, or in some interviews you find, and on some texts you find fragments of ideas about these things. But it was just another nature of approaching. You know, there is this fantastic book of Isai Berlin, the eagle, the eagle. How do you say it in English?
The hedgehog.
That's it. Thank you, Anne. The hedgehog, and the fox, and whereby Berlin divides political thinkers into categories. You have the foxes on the one side, and then the other gentle animal on the other side. And like the fox is the more fluid, intuitive thinker, and the hedgehog looks more kind of, rationalizes things and has an overall theory and view. And it's clear that, and the one is not better than the other, but these are like aspects which are present. And it's clear that Jan, in how he was running the museum and how he was taking care of people or not taking care of people, or how he was like bringing together the collection, he was more on the side of the foxes. And that was also maybe what the time asked. And also, for instance, which is indirectly also present in the current exhibition, he had a very complex relationship also with collectors. Very, antagonist relationship. I remember moments where he was not really treating Dr. Matthijs very respectful, but like insulting him on being a little petit bourgeois who was collecting a bit as a doctor, whereby, deep in his heart, I think he respected what Dr. Matthijs and his partner was achieving. But that's again this whole, the fact that he always needed an opponent, that he always needed someone in front of us. but with a kind of core sensitivity and alertness for changing conditions. And that's beautiful. The last interview he ever did before he was passing away was for RTBF, the French radio, Belgian radio, for the program Le Grand Charivari. And at the end of the program, each time the person is being asked, what is your core attitude in life? And Jan was saying, soyez alerte à tout ce qui change. Be attentive, be alert for everything which changes. And you know, it was for me it was very touching and incredible that he, at the end of his life, was saying this, knowing that on the one hand he was, you know, I think he had also his internal conflicts. He was advocating contemporary art, but he was at the same time conservative, and in some points very conservative and very religious. And you know, I think this kind of yeah, this complexities, these inner complexities, he was also exteriorizing towards all of us. But a fox.
Yeah.
Not about the collection to collect there was also a very simple way to collect was he was doing the exhibition, and then often the things in the collection were exhibition that he was doing. So basically he was then making a big work of an artist that was coming to Ghent, and then he was saying it's a pity to spend other money to we already spend money to produce it, we have now to spend money to bring it back. So let's think about to keep it in the museum. And I think a lot of works finished in the collection, just making a very good deal with the artist and saying, look, it's made for here, it's beautiful, it should be here. So the incredible thing of Jan, what he did really to have incredible good prices, to buy things for very, very low price, also because the artists, they were thinking that it was a good idea. They were also thanking him, so a lot of things were coming for good prices, and but also think about you were mentioning Jason Rhodes. I mean, Jason Rhodes, he didn't know, he was coming to Ghent, seeing Jan van Eyck and making a contemporary Jan van Eyck, and then probably there was no other option than to keep it in the collection. And I think it's
could have thrown it away. You could have thrown it away.
Otherwise, was thrown away. It was just or somebody's taking care or not. And again, there's a way not to collect, but to invent how to collect, or to make an invention of a collection that is not just buying something and finding the budget to buy something, but it's inventing what to buy, what is the budget, and all these kind of things. I think it was also part of this, how you were mentioning about being an artist. Jan Hoet as an artist was creating things. So he was creating the collection, was creating exhibition, was creating the museum. They were basically all kind of works made by a kind of creativity to think out of the box, to think about when there is no museum, you build a museum. When there is no collection, you invent a collection. And to find alternative ways to do things, and not. I think he was hardly following, and that is probably about this also this kind of theory. He was hardly following one existing path. He was building a path, and everything was built. And at the moment that was built, was I think Philippe, you were saying, when the museum was there, then it was of course not. No, okay, then there is nothing more to do because the museum was made, everything was made, and that is. But I think it was the process to think about in a new way that was quite important.
Great. Maybe just if we go back a couple of steps, because we discussed a lot in the meantime, returning to Chambre d'Amis. Again, Jan wanted to bring art to the people, which he also did literally by doing this exhibition in houses of 50 inhabitants of Ghent. It was quite a revolutionary model, I would say, that has been copied worldwide. How would you define its importance within the global second half of the 20th century art curating? It's a big question.
Well, that's a massive question. Like
or maybe, okay, no, sorry.
I'm willing to kick off, if you don't mind.
No, yeah, you can.
And I think it's also interesting that I think both Lorenzo and I were head of a curatorial program at the Appel, and it's one of the exhibitions that always appeared next to Op Losse Schroeven, next to Magicien La Terre, exhibitions that we wouldn't analyze with the students, but almost like as if you analyze a really, really long dead corpse, because there was not so much material that you could actually, I mean, an exhibition is ideas and art objects in space. If that exhibition is over, it's very difficult to really get to know it. So I think it's become this sort of paradigm that we adore, although a lot of people haven't experienced it. But I do think it's one of those major, if you have a canon, you have art history, and then you have a history of exhibitions, this is definitely a game changer. But I also think that we romanticize it because, I mean, maybe Philippe or Lorenzo have still I haven't seen it. I wasn't art aware at that time. But I also think it's this massive like entity that we adore. It's almost like an altar of exhibition making. But I think it had also sparked off a lot of other ideas about exhibition making. I, for example, was always fascinated by the sequel of Chambre d'Amis, Rendezvous, which I think was based on an idea of Bart de Bare, which was the reverse of like, okay, ask people from the city to bring their favorite objects to the museum, and artists then create installations out of those everyday objects. So I think this exhibition, on the one hand, is important as a game changer, but it has also sparked off a lot of other ideas about how is the museum related to the everyday, how is art related to banal objects. So I think we can't underestimate its enormous force, and that's unusual for an exhibition, because exhibitions are ephemeral moments. If you haven't experienced them, they're supposed to be over. And this exhibition seems to have an eternal life and sort of come again and again and again.
No, it's a big question for us also. In 26, it will be 40 years. What to do? Of course, you can have a very scientific approach and analyzing, okay, what has it been and so on and so on. But I think more relevant and also would be, okay, what would Chambre d'Amis mean today? In a digital world, in a city with a different demography, in a city with different questions and current problematics. So that's what we're like trying to head towards, in order not to kind of reconstruct or reconsider, but to try to have a window towards the future. Because in the collection of the museum, there is like, I think about 15 to 16 works of Chambre d'Amis. Most one could consider remnants, like leftovers. In that sense that you're like, you know, not anymore in the space for which they have been conceived. And in some cases, the works are still standing, like the Paul Tech or Mario Merz or some other pieces, but Jan Verkruijs is already more problematic. But I don't remember when, I think 2011, we succeeded acquiring the work Le Décor et son double of Daniel Buren, which is a key work of Chambre d'Amis, which was also problematizing the Chambre d'Amis, and it's also the connection with the Herbert Foundation. And a little anecdote, so when I succeeded in acquiring the public part of Le Décor et son double, I called Jan to say, listen, you know, I have good news. We are capable to secure a key work of Daniel Buren for the collection of the museum, and it's a co-ownership between Flanders and Ghent, which is also very nice and exceptional. And he had a kind of very typical...
He was pissed off, or?
He was not pissed off, but he said, are you happy now that you have the guest room of the Herberts in the museum, you know, like... But at the same time, of course, he knew, okay, which he was thinking back on the complex relationship with Herbert and Buren and so on and so on, but at the same knowing, okay, this was one of the key pieces of Chambre d'Amis, and which also synthesizes all the issues which were present in Chambre d'Amis. So I don't agree on that you can romanticize this exhibition. I think I have seen it and it made a big impact, everlasting still today. If I think back on the work of Luciano Fabro, for instance, or other ones, yes. But it's more a question how, as a museum, for this kind of key moment out of the exhibition history of the museum, but internationally, what to do.
To commemorate it.
To commemorate it.
And should we commemorate shows? That's maybe also another more general question. Like, should we just let it be? That was a revolutionary moment.
Well, that's why I say we have to make a window towards the future rather than looking back.
No, but the question is why it is such. So now, if you put the top 10 exhibition of the 20th century, you will have Chambre d'Amis. So that is now if you make a kind of chart. And that is
Top of the
a normal
pops.
process. We do that with art. We put an important art, we show it, and not important art, we put it on the storage. We do with a lot of things. We do that kind of things. We show the best of, and why this exhibition is the top 10 exhibition of the 20th century. And that is the reason is, I think, is very simple. One, because it's a very simple concept, very basic. Is to bring art in private spaces and to reverse the museum. So of course Bourin, he did this kind of very conceptual work about basically the museum is a public space with private people, and he said, okay, let's put in private spaces public works. So that kind of idea was to say what is the negative of the museum, or the positive of the museum, and you go to the houses, and that is basically, I think that Chambre d'Ami is a very political exhibition. First of all, is really to say, that the museum is, without people you don't have a museum. Without people that believe in art and in the exhibition and visitors, you don't have a museum. So you have to start the museum by a selection of houses, and then the selection was also very important, diversity. I mean, that is also, now it's a very normal term, but it was diversity, it was really choosing all different houses, all different people, all different backgrounds, all different neighborhoods, all different situations, and that was, and the other thing, the selection of artists was amazing. It was really a very good selection of artists. It was a very strong, so you have three important things, so the infrastructure, the content, and the idea, that to have this kind of three things, you need some decades, several decades you can have something, and also the reason that never there was made a Chambre d'Ami #2. That is interesting, So of course you had basically at least two ingredients needed. It was Jan Hoet and Ghent, and that I think also that to Jan Hoet and Ghent was a thing, because of course it was probably not working if Jan Hoet was doing that in another city, and there is also Ghent that plays an important role as a platform to think about this potential of exhibitions.
And what would the specific role of Ghent be, also looking at today? I mean, it was the hometown of Jan Hoet, but in what sense would Ghent still be, maybe more than any other city, to be able to generate other types of exhibitions?
I think the proximity of things. And the fact that Ghent is a metropole, but on a small scale. So everything which happens in Paris or in, let's say, Berlin or whatever, happens here, but controllable, discussable, manageable, which also means in terms of exhibitions like Chambre d'Ami or other ones, experiments can be done. And if I extend this towards the city and the city administration, there is very big, you can say it in different ways, but a very big tolerance, which means also appreciation towards the efforts that the museum does, and not only S.M.A.K, but also other museums do, which makes, according to me, Ghent a very fertile context to do exhibitions like back in those days, Chambre d'Ami, or later on Track or other things.
But at the same time, of course, it started here, and you could do a reenactment of this exhibition, but the model of this kind of exhibition has been especially used a lot in Belgium. I don't know, Lorenzo and Anne in Switzerland and France, I guess less. Here, of course, the tradition within S.M.A.K, Over the Edges track that Philippe curated together with Miriam Varadinis. But we reached a point in Belgium that almost every city, a given moment, had this kind of open-air exhibition. From Ninove, Sint-Niklaas, Tielt, you name it, the list is endless. And I'm wondering, is that also maybe something typically Belgian, typically Jan Hoet? Because you also talked about the reception of Jan Hoet as larger-than-life character is a typical Belgian thing. You think this idea of this extramuros outdoor exhibitions, is that maybe also something more specifically linked to this?
But I think that there is a difference between Chambre d'Ami and these other exhibitions, because these other exhibitions, they fall under a kind of definition that is called public art. And Chambre d'Ami was private art, actually, which was interesting, because it is really it was not public art. It was private. And that is the big difference with all these other exhibitions, that you have art in the public space, which is a very simple agenda that the politics wants because it's in the public space. But to me, it's exactly the opposite. Is the art in the private space, and that is, I think, that is the thing that is very hard. That all the other exhibition, it's not so easy to do. You can have kind of things that do both, but not just art in the private space.
And I would agree with that. Also, referring to what Lorenzo said something beforehand, that he said like, well, no, the first exhibitions were actually about liberating art from private spaces and making it publicly available. And then Chambre d'Amis somehow did another movement again, bringing public art into private spaces. And most of the location exhibitions, which I also see a lot of in Switzerland, like from Engelbert to Verbier, it's a desire to just create a big transparency or a big visibility, or maybe also a politically motivated Standort marketing. So I think this, and maybe that's why we find it so difficult to rethink now, like what it would mean now. Do we think radically differently about, because now the museum tries to be so much more than just a place for art. So then this in exchange with private spaces would probably function very differently, or I can imagine it's a total mindfuck to think of how you want to continue this. You invite people to live in the museum, so you reverse that
This
relationship.
happened already,
Yeah.
No, but extending a bit on Sam and also to Jan, I wouldn't know a second museum director in the world who wanted to make an exhibition in a place like Borken.
Yeah.
Borken is like a very tiny little city somewhere in Germany, close to the border with Holland, where Jan set up a kind of very ambitious, huge exhibition, or Hanmunden or other places.
Build
so
a
he had
museum
this
in Herford.
Herford. He had this kind of fascination for the periphery. Not like contemporary art is often connected to big cities and so on and so on. But he was interested how to infiltrate in other contexts. And maybe this has to do with his growing up in Geel and with this kind of connection which he had with very early on with people with mental fragilities. Or, he was, although he believed in the center, he was interested in the kind of the periphery of the center.
Could it also be because that creates more contrast and more opposition? I think he could not live without opposition, and doing things in Borken, in Herford, even in Arnhem, you know that there's going to be friction, resistance, like there's going to be frameworks that you have to break. And maybe that was also that he wanted to be this wrecking ball. And if you're in the center and if you're in the urban metropolis, maybe there's not so much to resist. Like so Lorenzo mentioned in the beginning, he reunited contrast, but he also needed that contrast to, I don't think to profile himself, but just to be able to think and to act.
Yeah, also to to give an access to I think that this biographical elements that Philippe was mentioning about Geel and about his father, it's a psychiatric situation with he had 5-6 people living in his house. They were already 7 brothers. It was a big family, and there were these patients, psychiatric patients, in his house that his father was bringing. But he was doing that with more houses in Geel. It was basically, there was this in Italy with Basaglia, so it was in the late 70s, it was already a law, and it was the first time that they know that psychiatric clinic were closed. But they were a lot in Europe. They were doing a lot of doctors. They were doing this idea to bring out several people with psychiatric issues to put it in the city. And basically, this idea to bring the people in different houses is the basis of Chambre d'Amis. It's the idea to bring the marginal, to work on the marginal. And that, I think, the similarity, and then there's also the exhibition Open Mind, that is, I think, is something very different from the concept of outsider art or art brut that was at the time. For him was more the idea that there is something that is in the margin of society, and art is one of the parts of it. And also his whole idea of art was always to go to look for these things. So he was always going he was always very curious and going to studio visit and to see things that were on the edge, no? And over the edge, of course, is the head of an exhibition. But basically, all these kind of things are like geographically, you know, the periphery, the marginality of people with, you know, mental problems, the idea of, you know, art. No, basically they had always the same. It's the same idea to go and to find where something is, to not to be in the center where everybody is, but you have to go and you have to find something in another place. And that, I think, is one of the he grew up in this kind of context, so he was always in his point of view. He could not escape from this kind of vision.
And then if we move on to the next chapter, basically after the international success of Chambre d'Amis, Jan got invited for Documenta 9, part of the exhibition Private Passion, Public Duty. On the ground floor, one side is like showing works that were invited, that artist Jan Hoet invited for Documenta 9. Until this very day, on the website of Documenta, the 9th edition is described as one of the most popular, actually. However, international critics were a bit more negative. How would you look back, or I mean, if seen in reality or based on press clippings or whatever, how would you look back on Documenta 9 actually?
I think that one remarkable element, and maybe it's too much honor, but that doesn't matter. Maybe it was a forerunner in terms of paying attention to artists from other territories than the European or the North American territory. I think Documenta 9 was the first one involving strongly artists from South America, Africa, Asia, and so on and so on. In that sense, he was already like planting a seed of things which we consider today logic and more than necessary. So this is something, I think, which is an incredible merit of the exhibition. And then, of course, I think the fact that he was very sensitive and proud about it. I think the fact that it's still mentioned as the one exhibition which had the most success and the most people who got in touch with contemporary art and also like normal people and not being so much familiar with contemporary art. I remember when I went to the last one, I started to talk to a person. And he said, I saw, except Documenta 1, I didn't miss any. And he said the one exhibition which was the most generous also towards the people of Kassel itself and towards the city, and was generous towards the city and giving to the city, was the one that Jan has been doing. And that's again this kind of, you know, this trying to operate on, you know, like the professional level and the international artistic community, but at the same time, you know, being very interested what the waitress of the Italian restaurant thinks about Documenta. But this globalization avant la lettre is like one of the key elements, I think.
But that's quite remarkable, I think, because often, I mean, Jan Hoet came from a different generation. We see him more in a bipolar world. For example, there was the dominance of American minimalism, hence we also started the exhibition here at the ground floor. Global South seemed to be less present initially in his discourse, also less in the collection, but so you think he still had planting some seeds there for later on?
Yeah, Adriana Varejão, Jacques Lerner,
Ricardo
Brey.
Absolutely. We now think of the global South as and as the expansion, but I remember Jan also always talking about like, well, you know, our generation, we were only looking at Northern Europe and America, and already looking beyond, looking at Hungary, looking at Poland, looking at Czechoslovakia, looking at the Soviet Union, was an expansion of that very, very narrow axis. So I think in that sense, I agree also with Philippe. He already opened up another border, and it wasn't this wild shift, but it was opening the door and enlarging an understanding, because that's something I remember very vividly that he spoke about, that he felt sorry for our generation in a way on two levels. One, if we wanted to be museum directors, that our role was not solely art, that it was a lot to do with money, people, building, infrastructure, politics, and that his main drive had always been art, and he had been able to sort of live that. And the other thing they said, well, now the art world is so incredibly big, you have no idea where to start. And he said, if you look, he was in that sense indirectly self-critical, saying if you would compare the exhibitions of Rudy Fuchs, of Caspar Koenig, maybe less Pontus Hulten and me, you'll see a lot of the same artists reappearing. We didn't discover so many people. No, like we sort of knew what we knew, and we had a limited playground. What I wanted to say with that, I think so he was aware of that limited playground and still opened up another door, but not in a way that now we see as groundbreaking. But it was, yeah, maybe not pushing the limits, but opening the door.
And you were just mentioning indeed some of his predecessors. The idea of this talk is basically inviting people like yourself, and like you, if I can say so, who were groomed by Jan Hoet. Of course, Jan Hoet didn't fall out of a coconut tree, to use a term that's been popular recently. Who would you have seen as amongst the dinosaurs or the by now mainly deceased curators, S.M.A.K, Koenig? Who would you see as one of his biggest, Karel Tienpont, but of course that's more Belgian story. Would you see as his biggest source of inspiration?
Karel Gerland, you mean?
Well, I mean, that was of
Not
course...
Karel Tienpont, huh?
Gerland, sorry. Of course, there was a different generation, different style, but like these international big shot curators you were just mentioning.
But they were his contemporaries, and I don't think he really admired them. It's more that they were fighting each other and occasionally befriend each other. I wouldn't know. I don't know who Jan admired.
I think that there was one was Pontus Hulten was one that was an older generation that for him was for sure somebody he was looking, and of course S.M.A.K was the same generation, but he started much younger than Jan, and S.M.A.K was here for Champ de Mai, and then he was in the jury for the Documenta, and actually thanks also S.M.A.K he got Documenta, which indeed the Documenta is for sure it was the first Documenta to be after Le Magicien de la Terre, so to have all the corners of the world. And there was also Documenta that was he was appointed in '88, and so in '89 was a wall, and so you had the wall block of wall east block there was, and then in 1990 was that for the time was really strong. Now we don't think about that very much, but at the time was very strong was the Gulf War, and the Gulf War was a really strong impact in the time too, because everything changed again after the war. There was of course this kind of big war, what was a new thing, and that was a big impact in the exhibition. That was very generous. Is also I think he was always very generous. Also in Hereford here, he was always. I think that in Kassel, if you go to Kassel today and you see all the artworks, most of them they were made during his Documenta. The Thomas Schutte that is still there, the Borowski, and he was really like indeed giving a lot when he was doing something.
But to answer Sam's question, I would rather say Joseph Beuys, or I would rather say Jimmy Durham, or I would rather say, I think his role models are his inspirational figures. Rather than colleagues or peers, it were artists.
That's a good point. I'm not sure I'm supposed to respond to my own question, but I would have said Harald Zeeman.
That's interesting.
Yes, because of course there's the notion of the individual mythology that Jan was always talking about, which S.M.A.K did, the idea of the artist creating his own universe. S.M.A.K was also quite busy with the irrational, outsider artist, trans-historical, so I think I see some...
S.M.A.K was also in the jury to appoint his follower. By the way.
Well, I think there were a lot of parallels between them, but I don't think they admired each other. And I think, and S.M.A.K was much more of a theorist, interested in Monte Verita and psychoanalysis and folklore and legends. But I do think, it's interesting maybe this is uninteresting for the audience and more we're having a trip down memory lane here.
Go ahead.
And I do think that that generation was still also of curators who felt an alliance with each other, but also really cut out their own profile. And I remember an antagonism that for him was productive was Rudy Fuchs. Because Rudy Fuchs was also the more cerebral, on the one hand also very poetic, but in a more cerebral way. And Rudy also at a certain point stopped being curious. I think he He
By the way,
stopped, like this was like, okay, this is the art that was interesting and now it stops. And Jan had this ongoing curiosity like Zeeman, also like Caspar Koenig, who till the end wanted to be surprised by art.
by the way, they did an exhibition together. They did an exhibition together in 1997, I think, in Palazzo Grassi in Venice, and it was an exhibition about Holland and Flemish art. And there was this what you were saying, this kind of, I think they were representing each of one a different country, not only a kind of position. They were this, the Dutch mentality and the Belgian mentality. They were really, in this Palazzo Grassi exhibition. I don't remember what was the title of the exhibition, but it was quite interesting. This kind of inviting them together to play about this difference, and it was really like opposites,
Yeah, reflecting
like
their
reflect the
personalities,
opposites.
but also their countries.
You're all museum directors, or you've been running a museum. It's something we already briefly mentioned. Being a museum director is, of course, more than making a beautiful program of exhibitions. It's also running a team, it's going for finance, etc. How did you? Of course, now the definition of museum has been completely redefined since Jan Hoet was running S.M.A.K. If you could put it that way, he put the foundation, and now next generations are evolving it. I'm thinking of you, Anne. You've mentioned the critical museum, fair practices, all these things. How do you feel like continuing a kind of legacy, but in a new way, in a new context, of course?
That's a very, very good question, because the longer I am a museum director, the less I think of S.M.A.K, the S.M.A.K I worked in, as a museum. I think it was an art center, and it had a collection, but it didn't function like a museum. It functioned like this explosive place where art happened, and it also had a lot of satellites, because Jan did exhibitions in that was in Herford, and when he was in Herford, he did exhibitions all over the world. So it felt like a sort of universe, a constellation. And I never really considered his way of running a museum as a model. Maybe because I was personally more inspired by his approach to art, how he dealt with art and artists, and learned a lot from them. But I think as a museum director, I learned zero from Jan. Quite the contrary. I think I do everything in reverse. The only thing I share is this desire that you want to make complex and mysterious things accessible to a lot of people. But I think his way was so unique, also so connected to Ghent, to his biography. And I don't think that's maybe also, he has never run a museum that already existed. Like Lorenzo said, he liked to shape things from bottom up. And usually museums are centuries old. So I feel like I'm avoiding your question. But I think I find that a very difficult one. And also that, as you said, the notion of what a museum is has so radically changed in the present. And for example, at the Kunsthaus, I really see it. We are a Musée de Beaux-Arts from the Middle Ages to the present. And I see that we can only exist if we're positively schizophrenic. If on the one hand we are sort of this palace of pictures, we venerate the past, we celebrate the big heroes, and we show how you can adore those almost icons of art history. And on the one hand, we should be exactly the opposite, like James Lee Beyer said, a center of curiosity where things happen, where we ask questions about the world, where everything is uncertain. So you have the very certain, the certainties of art history, and then the part where you question everything. And I think Jan Hoet was in the phase of the museum of building up a canon, and now I think most of the museums, we are questioning the canon and saying like, what have we forgotten? What did we not see? How do we relate to the present? And maybe the only part, and now I ramble on, but hopefully it makes sense. I think maybe I don't do it justice, because I think I did learn one very important lesson about the museum from him, is that it's not disconnected from life. That it's that you can't, and maybe it's also his non-hierarchical way of dealing with people. On the one hand, he was a very top-down person. He was the boss, but he gave his employees a lot of space. But how he dealt with people in general, he would treat a guard here exactly the same as a curator. Or as Philippe said, he would be interested in what does a cleaning lady think about the show, as well as the art critic. And I think that was very forward-looking in de-elitizing the museum. They say, well, we're not this castle on the hill. We should actually really try to connect to emotions and feelings and types of people all over the place. No, it should be a generous place that embraces as many people as possible.
Very nice words. I don't know if you want to
I
add
have more two anecdotes about what is the museum for Jan Hoet. One is from Italy. Was he said, yeah, when you were calling, the museum, like for example, Rudy Fuchs, you had to call the museum. The general person was answering. Then there was the secretary of the director. Then there was the assistant. Then finally the director. And when you were calling the S.M.A.K, there was Jan Hoet, taking the general phone. Jan Hoet and that was actually interesting to see that how direct he was in front of the public. He was there for the public, and that is, I think, something that is super rare, and you don't have the director on the front desk being there for everybody, talking with the people, and of course concentrating in that instead of other things. And then the one was Marta Herford. There was the administrative director. She was saying, we need something for the marketing. We should have one person for the marketing. And he say, marketing 9. No one for the marketing, because we all are marketing. We all do marketing, no? And we have to work in order. You don't need somebody that is doing that. And that, in a certain way, I think that this idea of bringing these two anecdotes together is to the museum now is really distant from what really is the sense. If you see the old marketing. Now you see more and more in museum, unfortunately, these museum shops where there are no books anymore. They sell everything like crazy, stupid stuff. Everything but not books. And it's crazy because you see that it's a kind of epidemic thing in museums that the level is going so down that of course people is not reading that much, understand, and you need to make money, but having this shop full of things and no books, and that is also this idea to create a kind of very easy form of visitor. They should not think, should not have troubles, should just get in, and at the same time, it's more and more difficult to have this kind of dialogue, this kind of discussion. And I think that is I think the museum, as Anne was saying, the idea of the museum of Jan Hoet is a museum where you go and you have an experience. It's not easy, like Jan Hoet was not easy, but you have an experience that is confronting. It's not pleasing. It's not making comfortable. You have to think. You have to know what is happening, and it's the sharp part of the creativity and what is happening. And that is, I think, it's a decision that is sometimes uncomfortable to do it because it's easier to make it, to have a low access, but I don't think it's not even democratic, this kind of low accessibility, that people don't have to think anymore and just bringing in this kind of consumption machine as the museum has just a lot of people and most of the people. So I think it's interesting that it is a kind of way that you have to change, to have...
yeah, but he was also about pleasure. Like it wasn't just difficult. And I think that's why I refer to this positive schizophrenia. I think Jan also made things just pleasant and warm and accessible and joyful, and on the other hand, challenging and difficult. And I think that's maybe what we can
playful.
take.
I think it was very playful. Of course, it was very playful and it was very creative. But I think creative was in a way. Of course, he was making exhibition like how and you use the art as a colors to make a painting. I mean, he was in the sense he was super creative and always with very strong ideas, but also this was difficult because it was also an impact, and it was always the kind of challenge, as a visitor that you had to see something, and it was always this kind of form, asking and giving.
Talking about the public and asking and giving, I was wondering, are there maybe some questions in the public? I don't know, the microphone.
I'm Patrick Viane. I worked with Jan in 78, 79, so the early Jan Hoet. As I studied art history, he was in the last step of the study, so we know each other very good. I remember the solicitation to get the job of psychological educative worker, something like that. He said, educative services are superficial. Art speaks for itself. But, okay, you can start if you want. What do you want to buy if you are the director? So Yves Klein? I said, no, Yves Klein. We have already one Yves Klein. Ah, you know the collection is very good. We have 2 million. What do you want? So I think René Heijvaart, Mark Maat, Philippe Van den Berg, no, they are not good artists. No. Say, but you ask my opinion. You have no opinion. I have an opinion. I'm worldwide known, and you are just a piece of shit. I went away, and then I said, I don't want to work with you. And I closed the door, he said, come back, you have the job. So this was Jan Hoet. Antigone, as explained by the 4 brilliant speakers here, fantastic evocation of the strongness, some weaknesses, human failures also. It was very difficult for artists too. But the difficult point was there were no objective criteria. It was so difficult. Because when René Heijvaart died, a personal friend, then he organized a retrospective or an important exhibition. So I said, who has the reason? I proposed it 20 years ago, or 10 years ago. No, it was 85 or 86. So this was complete, it was irrational. And when I saw him the last time, just before he died, here in the entrance hall, this was very emotional. So he said, you are a good guy. It was enough. So that was, for me, a very big patron.
Thank you for sharing that. Other questions or remarks or impressions or feelings?
Can I, as you mentioned the word shouting, and loud, and decibels, and all these kind of things, which is one of the first words I would connect to Jan. But I would like to comment on this in that sense. That was also the only way to be heard in the city of Ghent. You know, like now, if I would go into a negotiation with the mayor or with the deputy of culture about the new museum, we can have a kind of reasonable meeting, and we will not discuss the importance of what's on the table, and we will get to a conclusion or not, but we will be respected. And do not forget that back in those days, when Panamarenko was bought, the first work bought by the museum, or other works were bought, of the Joseph Beuys, this was always questioned and was always like, you know,
but
not
is
taken
that a
for
reason
granted.
for shouting, Philippe? I mean, I think
No,
I now live in a city where Marina Abramovic is still considered provocative. If I start shouting, that won't exactly fulfill a goal. No, like
but
you'd rather
was,
convince than
They cannot
and
shout. I
scream.
think it's,
what
it's
I want to
allowed.
say is that's a different paradigm today. That now you're in you're in kind of negotiation. You have a kind of another way to achieve certain goals, and you don't see the one on the other side of the table as an opposite, as a kind of
I still do.
as an enemy, you know.
But
But
maybe
back in
this
those
was
days, in the
also
70s, there was a big
that memory was also
juxtaposition.
about interpersonal between employees and him, and I think there.
No, but it happened on every level.
Yeah, but I think okay, you can shout up, but shouting down is something else. But at the same time, I think it was part of his personality. It was part of the time, and we all accepted it because there was always something else that he would truly see people. That he said to you in the end, you were a good guy. It was a compliment because that's maybe also too sentimental for this, but I felt he really had a Röntgen perspective on people. He knew each three of us, he really knew who we were. Not just as employees, but as people. And you accepted the shouting and the irrational. I remember one I had here in the hallway of the S.M.A.K was the opening. I even forgot whose opening it was, but I begged to, or I differed with him an opinion on the importance of Tate Modern. And then he shouted 2 hours long that I was an absolute nitwit, I was fired. If I liked the Tate Modern, that's impossible, like Miroslav Balka. And then even the artists, Miroslav Balka and Michael Bormans, tried to interfere and say like, Jan, come on. But then in the end, you accepted that because another day he would tell you something about yourself that was absolutely remarkable. And so in his, he was very, very human in both a negative and positive sense.
But
Not
that's
to dismiss
different.
what you're saying, but I think it was also his personality to shout up. Like,
But I think it's this attitude and this shouting was. I'm now after 10 years. I was working it's a small foundation in Rome called Volume, and we invite Jan to make an exhibition in 2011, and then he had this concept about 3 painters, Herbert Brand, Jan van Imschot, and Jens Wolf. So three very different positions. And then when we planned the exhibition, then he was ill, and then after 1 year he died. So after 10 years, we think we are going to remake the exhibition of Jan Hoet 10 years later. But it's interesting about this way to put these 3 artists together. So almost also kind of shouting hard about what is painting, no? And there are 3 totally different positions that are really like this big contrast. And it's interesting to say how you can combine the difference and create this kind of tension. It's in everything. It's the same. No, it's the same idea to create tensions. Among people, among artworks.
yeah, maybe that's something we can still learn from him, because this is not an exact quote, but I remember Orhan Pamuk once saying that fiction, and for me, by definition, every art is a form of fiction, is this moment where you can hold contrasts together. No, thing that normally should not be together, or conflicts. That when you can put that together, that's fiction, that's art. And I think, Jan, in general, I think you analyzed that very carefully and indirectly today, Lorenzo. That was really one of his qualities. Like, how you put impossible entities together, whether it's people or artworks or attitudes or.
I mean, you have to dare to do it. It's also not so easy to because it's a risk. Of course, it's a risk. But it's a statement, and he was doing that through exhibitions. That was really his thing. He could make a statement by putting together different things, and that is probably what you were saying about Sam about Zeeman. Zeeman could also do things. The Biennale of Zeeman in Venice was like exactly this idea of contrast. Which the problem of the Biennales and this big exhibition today is that there is no contrast. Everything is exactly right, but at the same time it's not right, because you need this kind of one against the other, because this positive negative to create this kind of battery thing. If you put the battery, all the positive, then it's not working. So you need this kind of contrast, and Zeeman was in this sense really close to Jan Hoet to create this kind of.
I gave a good response to my own question, actually. Otherwise, any questions, remarks in the audience?
Just introducing 2 terms that I think could be relevant to thinking of what we can still learn from Jan Hoet. Because if I think that Jan Hoet would be director now, he would be fired immediately, because we're talking about, I think the art world has in the past years really been talked about as a safe space, as a place for to dismantle power, and a safe space, while he was actually more of a brave space person. And I think, this term of a brave space instead of a safe space could open up something. So, yeah.
That's really interesting. Do you want us to respond, Nina? Or?
No, I think he would not be fired. I think he would be in jail.
Deported to a lonely island.
But the question is,
Alcatraz.
I totally agree with your analysis, Nina. But it's how can you merge, or how can you
Be both.
harmonize these 2 periods? Because this period is also present in the collection and is present, in the biography of the museum in this case, or also in other places. And how can you make one fabric out of it? And then I do think that we mentioned certain things. Imagine if I would, the 4-letter word that S.M.A.K is, I think for Jan the S was the most important letter. The stedelijke, the municipal. I think this is something, which is even today more important than ever. Towards different kinds of groups, or like the museum collaborating with youngsters who are almost dropouts, or the museum collaborating with refugees, and so on and so on. like in that sense, there are some elements of his practice or of his being, which we can integrate today in the positive sense, but also other elements of his practice to, as a kind of anti-example, of course. But that's a difficult question to answer, what exactly it is. But I think this idea of connecting the museum with life, or with the city, or you know, like something in which he was like a genius. You know how he was capable to.
Yeah, he would never use certain concepts, I say, for brave space, but he would live it, no, and execute it in that sense.
I think that the two things, they should be also together in a sense. You cannot have a safe without a brave, because probably there was nothing to save if there wasn't a brave, because it was a museum. So I think no, it's quite important to think also not to. You can have a safe place when you have something that you can save, but then he was also somebody that was contextualizing a lot of things. He was always thinking about the context, which is something that today is often we don't do anymore. We think we just put the things out of context and think, how is possible. But if you put things in context, you understand why. There are a lot of things were in a different way, and why we think in a different way. And we think in a different way because now we have the possibility to think in a different way. And that is a kind of process of contextualization. And I think he was doing a lot that kind of efforts to always find a reason, to contextualize an artist, a person, what you're saying, He was looking at a public, an audience. He was always making effort to contextualize things.
Okay, thank you. Any other question, remark, memory, whatever? Yeah, go ahead.
I learned a lot here, and especially the evolution that Jan has made during his whole career. That was not very clear for me, especially the last years. I followed less the last years. But for me, I think a crucial exhibition was also Open Mind, regarding the existence also of the Ghislain Museum and the relationship with outsider art, etc., etc. And this is, I think, a moment when his horizon became very wide, also to non-European artists, because you have different opinions, I think, about this point. I think, indeed, Jan Hoet discovered very late African art, Maori art, and so on, and also contemporary art in what we know as third world countries. So this is a very important development in the post-Hoet period, this global perception of art in the world, without losing the local context of the city, with exhibitions of the man of dance, his name, Raoul de Keyser, and people like him. So this is, I think, a very important evolution that Hoet prepared, and that was developed and is developing now, still now, I think. Sorry, I'm very long.
No.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't know if you want to respond or we call it a day. It's apparently nice weather outside.
I think those are very nice closing words that we, in the spirit of Jan Hoet, we hand over.
Voilà. Thank you very much for being here. Much appreciated. And thank you also very much for being here, for asking questions. And enjoy it.
Thank you, Sam, also.